Welcome, everybody, to this week's lecture about democracy. And these are the things that you should know by the end of this lecture. So we're going to start with an overview of states, citizens, and regimes before we start talking about democracy specifically. All right, so states. What we know is that all modern states make people obey certain laws, right, that all states have, and they regulate their lives to some extent. And all modern states also have to justify why they are able to do so, right? So this goes back to that third dimension of power, where you're trying to convince somebody why they should do what it is that you want them to do, right? So all modern states have to justify why it is that they are in charge. And they do this in various ways that are embedded within regimes. So the way in which modern states differ from each other is the extent to which they are compelling people to do things, they're intervening in people's lives, and the extent to which people's lives are also subject to the power of the state. And so, like I mentioned just a moment ago, right, these differences in what the state expects from its people and also the reasons that it gives for those expectations are what we call regimes, the set of formal and informal political institutions that define a government, right? So this is, if you remember back to one of the previous lectures where we talked about what's the difference between a state, that's what it's ruled, a regime is how a state is ruled, and a government is who is ruling the state, right? So regime is how that state is ruled. And what we're going to talk about in this chapter is the regimes that are listed here, 1 through 6. All right, so what we know is that states are continuous. Yes, we already talked about the fact that states' borders can change, and they have changed over time, but generally, once those borders are established, especially when other states recognize the borders of a particular state, those tend to not change. Regimes, however, can change. Some countries, some states have had the same regime their entire existence. That would be the case, for example, with the US. With the UK, as what's listed on this table here from your textbook. Some states have had different types of regimes over time, right? You can see from this table here that Nigeria has had 8 different types of regimes. Brazil has had 5, and governments can change even more regularly than regimes, especially in democracies which have free and fair elections. So whatever your time frame is for holding that elections, your government may or may not change depending on who's voted into office. All right. So what we know about regimes is that they are characterized by political ideologies, which are defined for you on this slide here. And the way that you can think about political ideologies is they have a descriptive component and a normative component. So in the descriptive component, they describe how the world is, right? And the normative component talks about what the world should look like, and especially what should be the role of government in society. And ideologies differ a lot in terms of one, how formal they are, how much of a explicitly stated worldview they have. Some are more, some are less. But generally, when we're talking about political ideologies, we're saying who should be allowed to participate in politics, how much they should be allowed to participate, and how much power they should have, right? And then ultimately, one way we can think about differences between regimes is, do the needs of individuals and specifically of citizens come before the needs of the state and the nation, or do the needs of the state and the nation come before those of people? And generally, the answer to the former question is what we would expect democracies to espouse, and the latter question, do the needs of the state come before people? That's what we would characterize as non-democratic regimes. All right, so talking further about states and citizens, right? Who are the people that states claim sovereignty over? Well, when we're talking about the modern state, we're really talking about citizens, right? Your citizenship is tied to the justification that the regime gives for why it should be in charge, right? It's supposed to represent and speak on behalf of the people. And yes, this makes sense in democracy because leaders come to office through free and fair elections, but even in non-democracies, leaders they really go to great lengths to try to justify why they need to be in charge, especially because they are not in charge through free and fair elections. So you may see leaders saying things like they're the only ones who can save the country, right? The military has to step in and restore law and order because the previous government was doing an awful job and things were not safe, right? So all regimes make these claims, right, to speak on behalf of people, even if the people on whom they're speaking on behalf of don't get to have a say in that at all. All right, so we can also talk about different types of rights that citizens have, right? Civil, political, and social. And these rights will become relevant for us when we talk about different types of democracies. And talking about democracy, so democracy has obviously Greek origins, as is mentioned on the slide here. And really what we're talking about is a system in which power rests with the people who exercise it either directly or indirectly, right? And indirectly would be through a representative democracy where you're voting for leaders who are going to represent you. But you do so and you expect that you will be exercising power by voting and running in elections, or like voting in elections, through competition, through political parties, and through freedom of speech and assembly. So there are different ways to define democracy, and comparativists have spent quite a lot of time debating amongst ourselves what is the best way to measure it. And so I'm going to show you on this slide and the next slide two kind of broader sort of meta ways of thinking about democracy, and then we'll focus on democracy that's defined by different varieties of rights. So in this minimalist definition of democracy, this procedural one, right? What makes a country democratic is, as highlighted here, having certain procedures, rules, and methods related to political rights. So like, how do you have elections? And then what happens outside of the electoral process, right? So like directly after elections and in between the time that you have one and the other, how are your rights protected? And those would be civil rights. Right? So when we're thinking about a minimal definition of democracy, we're really talking about, like, we're sorting countries into those that have political and civil rights and specific rules for electing leaders versus those that don't. Another way in which we can think about democracy is a substantive definition. Here, what makes a country democratic is not just having those rules and procedures, because those are important. You have to have them to be a democracy, but it's focused more on the outcomes that come from the democratic process, right? So things like, how much participation do you have in society? How much civil society is involved? How much equity and equality do you have? How much accountability, etc., right? So if we're thinking about a substantive definition of democracy, we might look at, for example, voter turnout. And if we're thinking, we want to have high levels of voter turnout, and that's the way that we characterize countries as being democratic or not, of course, assuming that they're having free and fair elections, then we might say, well, I guess countries in Europe are actually more democratic than the US because they do tend to have higher voter turnout, right? Or maybe we think a good outcome for democracy would be, once those leaders come to office through free and fair elections, they really focus on reducing unemployment, either through policies or by providing a greater social safety net, right? So maybe if the outcome that we're interested in democracy is lower unemployment, then we might say, well, maybe the US is actually a better democracy because it has lower unemployment than countries in Europe. So that was our kind of meta, like, bird's eye view, two broad ways of thinking about democracy. Here's another way that we can think about democracies and how they differ from each other. So like, we're kind of sampling different flavors of democracy, if you will. we can focus on the rights that democracies provide. So we have electoral democracies, which are listed here, liberal democracies, and social democracies. We're going to go over each briefly. So, electoral democracies. There's a political scientist by the name of Adam Przeworski who said democracy is a system in which parties lose elections. So this is our ultimate bare bones, minimalist, like you have to have this to be considered a democracy. So what this is you have free and fair elections and a peaceful turnover of leadership, right? So there's a definition of free for you. There's also a definition of fair. Free has to do with who is able to vote. Fair has to do who is able to run for office, right? So basically what you have with this electoral democracy, and this is a definition on which all political scientists do agree. Like if you do not have these characteristics, you are not a democracy, right? So here's an example from the Varieties of Democracy project. This is a data collection project at a university in Sweden, and they do a fabulous job of collecting all kinds of information about democracies and different types of regimes, and this is how they categorize electoral democracies, right? Okay, and here's just a slide to kind of illustrate that the dominant party in Japan for a long time, the Liberal Democratic Party, did control the government through free and fair elections for a number of years, right? So usually when we think about one party being in charge for a long time, we might think like, well, is that country really a democracy? But if we're just basing it solely off of having free and fair elections and a peaceful turnover of leadership, then yes. Even though the LDP ruled for such a long time, they came to power through free and fair elections. So they were doing a good job with managing the campaign platforms and the policies that they were promoting to appeal to voters. So using this definition of electoral democracy, even though the LDP was in power for a while, Japan was still a democracy during that time. All right, so liberal democracies. We're kind of adding things on to our democratic ice cream sundae, if you will, right? We start with our base flavor, which is electoral democracy, and we're adding on a new topping, which would be you have everything that electoral democracy has, free and fair election, plus a peaceful turnover of leadership, plus you are adding these additional rights for people, right? So checks and balances, the rule of law, protection for individual and group rights. And these are the rights that are provided for by liberal democracy, right? So you can see, yes, some of these do have to do with free and fair elections, but some of them don't. Some of them are freedom of expression, freedom of association, having political competition, alternative sources of information. You know, those aren't just specifically related to voting and what happens after you vote. And so liberal democracy came out of the idea of liberalism, and liberalism here, we're talking about liberalism as a political ideology that originated in response to absolute monarchies and the idea that individuals were endowed with certain rights just based on the fact that they were human. That emerged in, say, for example, the French Revolution. We're not talking about liberals in the American sense, right, where we think about Democrat equals liberal and Republicans are conservative. We're really talking about liberalism as an ideology. And here is VDEM's measure of liberal democracy, right? You could see on the left, you have all of the elements of electoral democracy related to free and fair elections, but on top of that, we add additional checks and balances and protection for individual rights. Okay, and then just to kind of illustrate that this term liberalism can mean different things, here's a slide that just demonstrates what the term liberalism means as both a political attitude, what we think of it as an ideology outside of the U.S., right, focused on free markets and individualism, as an ideology in the U.S., which is usually what we think about when we talk about social democracy, and then from a political economy standpoint. All right, so Now we are talking about social democracies, right? So social democracies, we're adding kind of another flavor onto our democratic Sunday, if you will. We're going to run with this analogy. You have free and fair elections, right? You have protection of individual rights and checks and balances, plus you have an additional focus on trying to provide for more of a social safety net, right? To distribute resources more equally. So this does mean more public control of the economy, but you still have a market economy. And in another lecture, I talk about the differences between social democracy and socialism. This is still a democracy. People are still getting elected through free and fair elections. The government, even though there's more public control of the economy, we're not talking about the Soviet Union and their command economy where you have bureaucrats who are telling factories exactly how many sneakers they need to make. That's not what we're talking about with social democracy. It's still a market economy. It's just that there's a greater focus on raising taxes so that then you can provide more services to people, essentially. Right? And here's the way that VDEM measures social democracy. All right, and that is it for this lecture.